Biochar is our way of taking atmospheric carbon dioxide and pumping it into the ground for hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years. We're going to cover the basics today on this non-wormy video. My name is Steve Churchill, and this is the Urban Worm Company. Okay, gang, I'm a worm guy, but I've got a mini obsession with biochar right now. I love the concept of taking waste that will become atmospheric carbon dioxide and turning it into a stable form of carbon that can last in the soil for hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe millions of years or longer. And oh, by the way, provide that soil with fertility, water retention, and pollutant remediation along the way. And another oh, by the way, is that biochar is being used as a more environmentally friendly substitute in building materials, and we'll get to that towards the end. This isn't going to be an academic lecture. I'm the wrong guy for that. What I want to do is cut through all the academic language and tell you why I think biochar is a potentially game-changing soil amendment and maybe even an earth changer too. Gang, if you like these topics and want me to make more videos on them, please like this video, hit subscribe, and hit that little bell to let you know every time we release a new video. Okay, I gotta admit, it took me a while to understand what people meant by carbon sequestration. I just didn't understand the mechanics of it. But once I understood a little more about the carbon cycle, it started to make sense. And now I can't stop thinking about it. So carbon is changing forms and cycling between our atmosphere, our oceans, and our soil, and the hundreds and thousands of feet below our soil. Within this carbon cycle is a short carbon cycle, which is measured in days, months, and just a few years, and a slow carbon cycle measured in thousands, hundreds, or even millions of years. So if you take a tomato plant, for instance, it consumes carbon dioxide and releases oxygen through photosynthesis. Most of us learned that stuff in elementary school. Some of the carbon is sent out into the soil through its roots, and the rest is used to build up its biomass in the root structure and the above ground portion of the plant. But when that tomato plant dies, it decays and it releases that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And some of the carbon stays in the ground as a carbon-rich soil organic matter, or SOM. This is an example of the short carbon cycle, since it takes only a few months to complete that cycle. Even a tree that takes 10 to 15 years to break down is still releasing carbon into the short carbon cycle. The long carbon cycle involves the exchange of carbon between rocks and the Earth's surface and the ocean floor, which takes millions of years. An example of the long carbon cycle is atmospheric carbon dioxide coming into contact with slightly acidic rain, which slowly, and I mean slowly, dissolves surface rocks, which release magnesium, sodium, potassium, and calcium ions, which are carried by our rivers into our oceans, where they eventually get stored on the ocean floor and they aggregate in order to make more rocks. Also in this long carbon cycle is ancient organic matter, which has been heated and compressed in order to form shale and fossil fuels that are locked underground. Okay, geologists, I know you're pulling your hair out right now with this explanation, but it's the best I can do. What happens when we burn fossil fuels is that we move carbon in the long carbon cycle into the short carbon cycle, taking stable, naturally sequestered carbon deep below the surface and turning it into atmospheric carbon dioxide. And I know you've heard plenty about that. Now, this is where I had an idea to give you my thoughts on climate change. And maybe someday when I want to lose half my subscribers, I'll tell you what I think, because if you've got strong opinions about it, either way, my views aren't going to make you happy. So let's put a pin in that one and come back to it later when I want to torch my subscriber count. All right, all politics aside, the truth of the matter is that when we create biochar, we're reversing the long carbon to short carbon process and turning CO2 releasing organic waste into a longer form of carbon where it won't enter the atmosphere. So where we can, why shouldn't we take the steps to remove the input of atmospheric carbon and convert it into a stable carbon that we can store in the ground for hundreds or thousands of years? And this is where biochar comes in. Now, for those of you new to the concept, biochar is produced when organic matter like wood, grasses, and even manure is combusted in a really high temperature but oxygen-starved environment. That process is called pyrolysis, that preserves most of the carbon in that material. That carbon is stable, and it looks a lot like charcoal, and it's highly resistant to further decomposition, meaning once we put it into our soil, it's gonna stay there for a long, long time. We're taking that carbon dioxide that would be released by that waste in the next few years to way out in the future, way out in the future. So just like the burning of fossil fuels takes carbon from the long carbon cycle, takes it to the short cycle, the production of biochar takes short cycle carbon and moves it into something I won't quite call the long cycle, but it's a much longer carbon cycle than the short. And yes, I realize the scale of fossil fuel emissions is vastly more than whatever we're doing with biochar right now, but we got to start somewhere. But biochar buys time, but time isn't the only benefit. Biochar holds a lot of water and has a crap load of surface area and nooks and crannies that microbes can inhabit. It also improves the ability of soil to absorb nutrients and to release it to plants when the plants need it. It can also attract and bind with pollutants through a process called adsorption. Not absorption, but adsorption with a D, where potentially harmful, positively charged heavy metal ions can harmlessly stick to the surface of the negatively charged biochar. It's like a straitjacket for pollutants in the soil. We've actually started selling quite a bit of biochar this last year, mostly to farmers. But it's not just for the soil. Steel manufacturers are substituting biochar for coke, which is a similar substance to biochar, but it's made by burning coal. In quote-unquote green steel, that biochar is now providing that carbon. Biochar is also replacing cement as a binder in concrete, which reduces the financial and environmental costs of limestone and clay, which gets mined from the ground, cooked in a kiln, and then ground into a fine powder. So biochar is familiar to vermicomposting in that there are two categories of benefits to it. And I like to call these input benefits and output benefits. The input benefit of vermicomposting is the diversion of food waste and other organic wastes away from landfills where they would emit methane. The input benefit of creating biochar is you take a highly stable carbon out of what would become atmospheric carbon in a really short time. Sure, you're creating heat, you're volatilizing some gases in the process, but sophisticated biochar kilns can capture and use both of those. So even if you threw the biochar in the trash after you made it, its production is still a good thing. But we get the output benefit by putting this stuff in steel and in cement and in the ground to help our soil and grow more good stuff. And when we put it in the ground with worm castings, we can inoculate the massive surface area of biochar with the microbial populations to live in it, and some of the nutrients the biochar can then feed back to the plant. All right, so thanks for taking a detour away from worms in this video. I love learning about these soil amendments that are maybe a degree separated away from worms and worm castings, especially though when they work so well together. I just want to talk about them. All right, we'll see you next time.